Rain battered the glass facade of the government building, each droplet racing the next before merging into rivulets that blurred the view outside. Inside, the air carried a weight all its own, the sterile tang of metal detectors, the stale warmth of too many bodies pressed together, and the faint trace of damp coats drying under fluorescent lights. The line wound through the atrium like a sluggish river, bending around chrome stanchions in slow, grudging arcs. Most people in the queue fidgeted in quiet frustration, scrolling through their phones, shifting weight from one foot to the other, sighing with exaggerated volume when the line stalled. A few exchanged glances, silent partners in shared impatience. But one woman stood apart, not by position, but by the stillness she carried. Isolde Thorne stood perfectly straight, her posture betraying neither fatigue nor irritation. 68 years had etched silver into her hair, but not bent her spine. Her neatly coiled bun remained immaculate despite the rain. The plainness of her clothes was deliberate, a well-pressed navy coat, simple wool skirt, and sturdy shoes. She might have been mistaken for a retired teacher or a meticulous librarian, had it not been for the quiet authority in the way she held herself. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, the knuckles pale but steady. Her gaze stayed fixed ahead, not darting to the clock or scanning the people around her. She gave no outward sign that the weight bothered her. The murmur of voices and the electronic chirp of the metal detector seemed to pass over her like wind over stone. The security checkpoint ahead was in constant motion, been sliding along rollers, belts whirring, uniformed officers issuing clipped instructions. The rhythm was mechanical efficient in theory, but here it felt more like a ritual of attrition. People shuffled forward, surrendering belts, bags, and dignity in small increments. Officer Rustin was working his post with the energy of a man who had long since stopped believing his job had nuance. His uniform strained slightly at the seams, the nameplate gleaming under the cold light. He scanned the crowd with the narrowed eyes of someone trained to suspect first and verify later. His gaze moved in increments, dismissing most with little more than a flicker of recognition, until it landed on Isolde. He lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, as if standing in line was a task to be executed, not endured. Or perhaps it was the absence of the restless energy that radiated from the others. Either way, something in her presence pulled his focus. When she stepped forward to the front of the line, Rustin's hand came up, palm out. "Identification," he said, not unkindly, but without warmth. Isolde reached into her handbag and withdrew a laminated card whose edges had begun to yellow with age. She handed it over without comment. Rustin turned it over in his fingers, his frown deepening. "This is expired," he remarked, his voice carrying enough volume to be overheard by the next few people in line. "The appointment letter stated it would be accepted," she replied evenly. Her voice was calm, but carried a weight that suggested she wasn't in the habit of being contradicted. From her bag, she produced a folded letter embossed with the government seal. Rustin glanced at it, barely, before returning it. "Purpose of your visit?" "I have an appointment," she answered. "For what?" His tone had shifted, taking on an edge of probing curiosity. Isolde's reply came after the briefest pause. "It is personal." The lack of elaboration seemed to irritate him. Around them, younger, louder travelers were waved through with only cursory inspections. Rustin's attention, however, fixed itself on her like a lock snapping shut. He tilted his head toward a colleague, a stocky man with streaks of gray in his hair, the nameplate on his chest reading Lorette. "Secondary screening," Rustin said. "Step aside, ma'am," Lorette ordered. Isolde complied without hesitation, her posture shifting into something subtle but unmistakable, the faint rigidity of someone who'd once stood at attention for far longer than this. "Yes, sir," she said automatically. The officers exchanged a glance at her choice of words. Rustin gestured to the worn duffel she carried alongside a small rolling suitcase. "That one. Open it." "May I request a private screening?" Her voice was quiet, but the request was firm. "No," Rustin replied, the corners of his mouth tightening. "Open it here." The rain's steady drumbeat against the windows was the only sound for a moment. Then, without sigh or complaint, she set the duffel on the inspection table. The fluorescent lights above cast sharp shadows across her face, tracing the lines time had left there. More people began to slow their progress through the checkpoint, drawn by the tension like moths to a flicker of flame. "Is there a problem?" she asked, still giving nothing away. "That depends," Rustin said, "on what you've got in this bag." Nearby, a group of office workers paused, coffee cups cooling in their hands. One of them frowned at the scrutiny directed toward the older woman, but said nothing. Isolde's fingers rested lightly on the duffel zipper. "I would prefer privacy," she repeated. "And I would prefer compliance," Rustin countered. "We can do this here, or we can take you to a room where the questions get more thorough. Your choice." Something in her eyes shifted then. Not fear, not anger, but calculation. The look of someone measuring the risks before committing to a course of action. "Very well," she said at last, stepping back. Rustin snapped on a pair of latex gloves with a deliberate flourish, the sound loud in the stillness. Phones began to appear in the hands of onlookers, lenses quietly trained on the scene. If Isolde noticed, she gave no sign. Rustin's gloved hands descended on the duffel with a kind of theatrical precision, the kind that wasn't for the sake of efficiency, but for the audience now gathering. The table's cold metal surface reflected the harsh fluorescent light, throwing stark highlights across the bag's scuffed leather. "Let's see what's so important you couldn't show us," Rustin said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the ring of spectators. Isolde stood beside the table, her hands loosely folded at her waist, her expression unreadable. Only her eyes moved, tracking each motion without flinching. The posture was deliberate, neither submissive nor combative, simply still. Laurette positioned himself opposite Rustin, crossing thick forearms over his chest. His stance blocked part of the crowd's view, but made no effort to shield Isolde from the scrutiny. The first zipper slid open with a sound that felt too loud for the space, like tearing paper in a quiet library. Rustin reached inside and withdrew a prescription bottle. He glanced at the label, read the name aloud without asking, then set it down with a careless clatter. A second item emerged, a carefully wrapped frame, covered in layers of plain brown paper. Rustin turned it over in his hands, testing the corners, as if he might unwrap it then and there. "Please be careful," Isolde said, her tone unchanging, but the words landing with quiet weight. Rustin smirked but placed the frame aside, still wrapped. Next came a book, a dog-eared collection of Tennyson's poems, the spine worn soft from years of reading. He flipped it open, fanned a few pages, and set it down without interest. Behind him someone whispered, "Feels wrong, doesn't it?" Another voice replied, "Yeah, but can't look away." Laurette's eyes caught on a small, ornate key nestled in a side pocket. "Well, that's different," he said, holding it up to the light. "What's this open?" "It opened something that should have stayed closed," Isolde replied without hesitation. Her voice had a strange, distant quality now, as though the words had been rehearsed decades ago. The officers chuckled, a humorless, dismissive sound. From the duffel came more items, each set out in a growing line on the table. A folded scarf, a handwritten letter in faded ink, a document stamped confidential with medical notations visible. Rustin read a line aloud from a letter, ignoring its personal nature, then tossed it down. Laurette found a small notebook, the cover worn thin. He squinted at a name scrawled across one page. "Operation Dresdenvale," he attempted, mangling the pronunciation. "What's that?" "Some bridge club mission." Isolde's gaze didn't shift. "It is not for public discussion," she said, her voice so even it could have been mistaken for disinterest. "This is the problem with old people and their secrets," Rustin said, shaking his head. "They think they're more important than they are." Her lack of reaction was beginning to wear on him. He dug deeper into the bag, muttering to himself. His fingers closed around a small box. Without asking, he flipped the lid. Inside lay a pin, simple, unmarked, but unmistakably military in its design. "A little keepsake?" he asked. "Of people who are gone now," she answered. The words landed like the faintest tremor beneath the surface of her composure. Rustin set the box down carelessly, the pin sliding out and hitting the table with a metallic ring. For the first time, Isolde's eyes followed the motion, narrowing slightly. "Careful with that," she said, barely above a whisper. "Oh, is it valuable?" Rustin mocked. "Not in money." The final compartment of the duffel remained untouched. Rustin's gaze lingered on it, the way a gambler eyes a final card. He turned the bag slightly, so the zipper faced him. A woman from the line stepped forward. "Excuse me, is this really necessary? You've already checked everything else." Rustin shot her a glare. "Security protocol, ma'am. Please step back." Isolde gave the woman the faintest nod, acknowledgement without gratitude or dismissal, and turned her eyes back to Rustin. While Laurette radioed for an ID check, Rustin's hands moved toward the last zipper. The rain outside hammered the windows harder, as if marking the moment. The radio crackled. "Verification inconclusive. File restricted. Possible government employee." Rustin's eyes narrowed. "Government employee? Which department?" "I am retired," Isolde replied. "From what position?" Laurette asked. "That is classified." The words came so smoothly, so automatically, that a few in the crowd exchanged glances. The kind of automatic that came from saying them hundreds of times over years. Rustin laughed, but the edge in it was less certain now. "Classified. Sure. And I'm the president." The tension in the checkpoint had shifted. The officers were no longer just working through a stubborn traveler. They were in the middle of something neither could quite define. The audience sensed it too, leaning in as though the answer might fall out of that last zipped compartment. Rustin's gloved fingers hooked the zipper pull. "Last chance," he said, meeting her eyes. "Anything you want to tell us before I open it?" "I am not hiding anything," Isolde said calmly. "I simply value my privacy." "Privacy is a luxury in security situations," Laurette said, reciting the phrase like a line from a manual. The zipper began to slide open, each tooth releasing with deliberate slowness, and the crowd pressed closer, breath held. The zipper gave a final metallic rasp and fell open. Rustin reached inside, his hand disappearing into the depths of the duffel. When he withdrew it, he held a neatly folded piece of fabric, heavy, deep blue, the kind of cloth that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He gave it a careless shake, and the garment unfolded in the harsh glow of the checkpoint. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even to the untrained eye, it was unmistakably military. A uniform jacket, preserved with meticulous care. "Playing dress-up, are we?" Rustin asked, smirking as he held it up for inspection. But the smirk faltered almost instantly. His eyes, though far from expert, caught on something about the insignia, something that didn't match the ceremonial uniforms seen in parades or at Veterans Day speeches. Laurette stepped closer, frowning. "These markings? I've never seen some of these before." The jacket bore a strange combination of decorations. Familiar service patches alongside others that seemed almost foreign, their designs sharp, deliberate, and alien to standard issue. Medals gleamed faintly under the overhead lights, some so specialized that they wouldn't be recognized outside certain classified circles. "This isn't any regular uniform," one of the onlookers muttered. Rustin scoffed, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "Could be surplus stored junk. People love to stitch together a fantasy." He turned to Isolde. "Where did you get it?" "It was issued to me," she replied simply. That answer hung in the air like a weight. Laurette's eyes narrowed, searching the jacket more carefully. "There's a name tag here." His gloved finger brushed a faded patch stitched to the breast. "Thorne," he read aloud. He glanced at her. "Isolde M. Thorne. So it's yours." "Check the service number," she said, her voice still calm, but with a steel thread now running through it. "It should match my identification." Rustin dug the ID card from his pocket, compared the two, and hesitated. "They match." From the back of the crowd, a voice spoke, older, male, certain. "Those aren't parade medals. That patch there, I've only seen it in declassified photos from the 70s. Rustin's head snapped up. "Sir, please step back." The man raised his hands in mock surrender, but his words had already shifted the air. The earlier hum of amusement in the crowd was gone, replaced by a low current of unease and curiosity. "How did you come by this uniform?" Lorette asked, his tone softening, almost respectful. "I earned it," Isolde said. Rustin tried for a triumphant jab. Women weren't in combat roles back then. "Officially," she agreed. The word landed like a cipher. Several people in the crowd exchanged knowing glances, as though they had just caught the shadow of something bigger than themselves. "What exactly are you claiming?" Rustin pressed. "I am not claiming anything," she said. "I am here for my appointment." Movement at the far side of the atrium drew a few heads around. A tall man in a formal military dress uniform had entered from a side door, flanked by two younger officers. His gait was steady, deliberate, commanding, without effort. Stars on his shoulders glinted under the lights, a general's rank. Isolde's eyes flicked toward him for the briefest moment, then returned to Rustin. The general, scanning the room, caught sight of the jacket in Rustin's hands. His pace quickened. "Last chance," Rustin said, unaware of the shift behind him. "Anything you want to tell us?" "I told you," Isolde replied. "I value my privacy." The general closed the last few steps between himself and the checkpoint. Rustin finally noticed him, straightening instinctively. "Sir, this area is that Captain Thorne's uniform you're holding, officer?" The general's voice was level, but it carried the crisp authority of someone long accustomed to being obeyed. The room went silent. Even those not close enough to hear the earlier exchanges seemed to recognize the shift in power. Rustin blinked, thrown off balance. We were just—" The general turned his gaze to Isolde, studying her with an expression that revealed nothing. After a long moment, he straightened, raised his hand in a sharp, precise salute. "Captain Thorne," he said formally. "It has been many years." Isolde returned the salute with practiced precision, the movement so crisp it silenced any lingering doubt in the minds of the onlookers. "General Crane," she said, 40 years, I believe." The crowd murmured, ripples of surprise moving outward. "You know this woman, sir?" Lorette asked, voice careful. "Know her?" Crane's brows lifted. Captain Isolde Thorne was one of the finest officers I ever had the privilege to serve with. His eyes shifted back to the security officers. "Though I suspect her file only became available to people with your clearance recently." Rustin still held the jacket, but now with both hands, almost gingerly. We had no way of knowing." Crane's tone sharpened just slightly. "Her file was declassified last month. Today, she is here to receive recognition that has been withheld for decades due to the classified nature of her service." The crowd's attention, once fixed on the spectacle of a stubborn traveler resisting inspection, was now entirely captivated by the mystery revealed before them. The tide had turned, and Rustin, sensing it, began folding the jacket more carefully than he had unfolded it. "Return Captain Thorne's belongings," Crane ordered, with the same care and respect in which they were packed. Rustin swallowed, nodding. "Yes, sir." As the items were gathered, the uniform now laid reverently on the table, the checkpoint had transformed. This was no longer a scene of petty authority. It was a moment in which decades of silence, secrecy, and hidden service were breaking into the light. The silence in the checkpoint was so complete that the rain outside sounded like distant applause against the high windows. Rustin's earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced with the stiff, mechanical movements of someone trying not to make another mistake. Lorette moved with similar caution, carefully gathering each of Isolde's possessions from the inspection table. The wrapped photograph, the worn book, the ornate key, placing them back into her duffel, as though each item might shatter if handled too roughly. General Crane remained at Isolde's side, a quiet wall of authority that no one dare challenge. His gaze swept over the officers, then to the onlookers, whose phones still hovered midair. "Captain Thorne is here today for an appointment that will change the record of her service," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a ceremonial blade. "This is not a matter for public spectacle." Rustin cleared his throat, his voice oddly small. "We'd apologize for the misunderstanding, ma'am." Isolde regarded him evenly, her expression unreadable. "Respect," she said, is not earned by insignia or rank. It is earned by recognizing the humanity in others. The words fell like a quiet reprimand, and though she did not raise her voice, they seemed to echo in the fluorescent-lit space. A few in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and others nodded in agreement. General Crane's focus returned to Isolde. "Captain, if you're ready, we should proceed upstairs. The ceremony begins in 30 minutes. She nodded once, collected her duffel, and fell into step beside him. As they passed through the checkpoint, the crowd instinctively parted, their earlier curiosity replaced with a hushed respect. The two younger officers trailing Crane flanked them, creating a small, protective bubble as they moved toward the elevators. The top floor of the government building was another world entirely. Gone were the echoing footsteps and the impatient shuffle of the atrium line. Here, the space opened into a grand hall, its high ceilings arched with intricate molding, its tall windows flooding the room with fresh sunlight. The storm outside had broken. Rows of polished chairs faced a raised stage at the far end, where a lectern and ceremonial flags stood ready. Already seated were military officers in full dress, government dignitaries, and family members of the honorees. At the front row sat a small group of elderly men and women, each with a bearing that time had not diminished. The surviving members of Special Operations Group Delta. Isolde joined them quietly, exchanging nods and brief, firm handshakes. A white-haired man on her left gave a faint smile. "Never thought we'd see this day, Captain." His nameplate read Commander Malcolm Reed. "Some of us didn't," she replied softly. "They remembered," said a woman on her right, her voice low but sure. Ella Foster, another comrade from the years of shadows and silence. At precisely the half-hour mark, a Marine Guard's voice rang out from the doorway. "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States." Everyone rose. The President entered, flanked by senior military leadership, his steps measured and confident. The hush in the room deepened as he approached the podium. "Today," the President began, "we honor a group of Americans whose service was so extraordinary and whose mission so critical that the truth of their actions was withheld from public knowledge for decades." His gaze swept over the seated veterans. These individuals operated in the most dangerous theaters of the Cold War, places we were never officially present, to prevent crises before they began, and to save lives that history never recorded. One by one, the names were called. Each veteran rose, crossed the stage, and received their long-delayed recognition. When her name came, Captain Isolde M. Thorne, she rose with the same straight-backed composure she had carried at the checkpoint. The uniform jacket now rested across her shoulders, its deep blue fabric, perfectly pressed, the enigmatic insignia gleaming under the stage lights. The President spoke of what could now be shared: her fluency in multiple languages, her ability to operate behind enemy lines under assumed identities, her role in Operation Dresdenvale. "Captain Thorne's quick thinking and precise execution during that mission," he said, "saved 37 hostages and prevented an incident that could have escalated into a global conflict." He lifted the Distinguished Service Cross from its velvet case and pinned it carefully to her jacket. The room rose in applause, sustained, resonant, not for the medal itself, but for the years of unrecognized service it symbolized. Isolde returned the President's salute, then stepped back to her place among her comrades. After the ceremony, a reception unfolded in an adjoining hall, the kind with polished floors, trays of champagne, and conversations in low, admiring tones. Officials drifted toward the honored veterans, eager for anecdotes or photographs. Isolde stood slightly apart, a glass of water in her hand, her gaze moving over the crowd without lingering. General Crane found her near a tall window. "How does it feel, after all this time?" "Strange," she admitted. "To speak openly of things we were ordered never to mention. To be recognized for events we were told never happened." "Times change," Crane said. "Do they?" she asked, glancing at him. "Or is it just that those who wanted the secrets kept are no longer alive to protest?" Before he could answer, a familiar voice interrupted, tentative, but determined. "Captain Thorne." Officer Adira Ellis, now out of uniform, stood just inside the reception hall. "I was invited by General Crane," she said quickly. "I wanted to apologize properly for how you were treated earlier." "You were not responsible for that," Isolde replied. "I was a witness," Ellis said, "and I stayed silent." She hesitated, then added, "What you said about service happening where no one is watching. I've been thinking about that." Isolde studied her for a long moment. "Why did you join security, Officer Ellis?" "To protect people. To serve." "And do you feel you are achieving that?" "Not always," Ellis admitted. "Sometimes it feels like authority becomes the point instead of service." "A common hazard in any position of power," Isolde said quietly. "The challenge is to remember that dignity, yours and theirs, is part of the duty." Ellis absorbed the words, her expression shifting from embarrassment to something more resolute. "Thank you for your service and for saying what needed to be said." Isolde gave a small nod. Sometimes people only need permission to believe what they already know. The reception began to thin as officials and dignitaries drifted toward their next appointments. Conversations dimmed, the clinking of glasses softened, and the grand hall's energy settled into a quieter rhythm. Outside, the sky had cleared completely, the pale gold of late afternoon spilling through the tall windows. Isolde remained by the window, her duffel resting at her feet, the Distinguished Service cross pinned securely to her uniform jacket. She had exchanged a few polite farewells with her former comrades, but now she stood alone, the bustle of the room fading into the background. General Crane approached one last time. "They'll want to interview you," he said. "Press outlets are already waiting downstairs." Isolde shook her head. "Recognition is one thing. Exhibition is another." "You won't tell them the details?" "Some things belong to those who live them," she said. "They're not meant to be consumed like entertainment." Crane studied her, then nodded. "Always the most private of heroes." "Not a hero," she corrected softly. "Just a soldier who did what was necessary." They shared a brief handshake, the kind that spoke of mutual respect earned over decades. Then Crane moved off, leaving her in the stillness. By the time Isolde left the reception hall, the corridors of the upper floors had grown quiet. She stepped into the elevator and descended alone, the slow hum of the machinery giving her a few moments of uninterrupted thought. She replayed the day's events in fragments. The bright flash of Rustin's latex gloves snapping on, the crowd's murmurs when the uniform had been revealed, the sudden shift when Crane arrived. It had been years since she had been scrutinized so openly. The faces were different, the setting changed, but the feeling was familiar. A room full of strangers trying to decide what she was worth. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened to the building's ground level. Near the entrance, she saw Officer Adira Ellis waiting in civilian clothes. The young woman straightened as she approached, her expression a mixture of determination and deference. "Captain Thorne," she said, "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but would you mind if I walked with you for a bit?" Isolde regarded her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Walk with me." They stepped out into the cool, rain-washed air. The streets glistened under the late sun, reflecting long ribbons of light. For a while, they walked in silence, the rhythm of their steps filling the space between them. Ellis spoke first. "I wanted to ask you about finding meaning in service. It's why I joined, but lately," she hesitated, searching for the right words. "Lately, I feel like I'm just enforcing rules, not protecting anyone." Isolde kept her eyes ahead. "That's the nature of service in uniform, any uniform. Some days, the purpose is clear. Others, it's buried under layers of procedure and politics. The trick is to remember the purpose exists, even when you can't see it." Ellis nodded slowly. "And when people disrespect you, when they treat you like you don't belong, you maintain dignity," Isolde said simply. "Not because you always feel dignified, but because it denies them the power to diminish you." Ellis glanced at her. "That's what you did today." "That's what I've done most days of my life," Isolde replied. "People judge what they can see. Your responsibility is to know what's invisible, your own worth, your own truth." They walked another block before Ellis asked, "How did you know?" "Back then, that what you were doing mattered. You don't always know in the moment, Isolde said. Sometimes you only know years later, when you see what didn't happen, the crisis that never came, the lives that were never lost. The absence is the proof. Ellis absorbed that quietly. They reached a quiet side street, far from the main government district. The air smelled faintly of wet pavement and budding trees. Isolde slowed, turning slightly toward the younger woman. "Officer Ellis," she said, "service isn't about being thanked or recognized. Most of the time, no one will ever know what you've done. That's not a flaw in the system. It's part of the price. If you can live with that, you'll do just fine." Ellis's eyes held steady. "I can live with it. I just needed to hear it from someone who's been there." "Then remember this," Isolde said. "The greatest service often happens in places where no one is watching." For a moment, neither spoke. The sun dipped lower, casting their shadows long on the damp pavement. "Thank you," Ellis said finally. Isolde gave a faint smile, not sentimental, but approving. "You already knew. I only confirmed it." They parted at the corner, Ellis turning back toward the city center, Isolde continuing down the quieter street. Her duffel hung at her side, its weight familiar and reassuring. Inside it, the uniform and medal rested together, symbols not just of past deeds, but of the silence that had guarded them for so long. Ahead, the street opened toward a park where the wet grass glowed in the fading light. She had no plans for the evening beyond walking until the city's noise softened to a hum. Somewhere behind her, the checkpoint continued to process travelers, people important, people ordinary, all moving through under the same roof, subject to the same protocols. She hoped, though, that the officers working that line would remember what they had seen today, that dignity can stand even under the harshest lights. As she stepped into the park, the air cooler now, she thought of the comrades who hadn't lived to see this day. Their names would not be read aloud, their deeds never described in speeches. But she carried them with her, as she always had, in the quiet spaces between what the world knows and what it will never know. And in that there was a kind of peace.